born in London. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. Good evening, good night, or good morning to all of you. We are pleased to have people in this meeting from all over the world in different time zones. I am Amanda van der Helm. I was born in London and I lived in St. Lucia with my family when I was younger. I'm a Master's in Fine Arts student in the Royal College of Art in London. This is the 177th edition of our Zoom public meeting. We wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 176 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. That's dedication for you. In the past 3 years and 8 months, we have featured 748 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 176 topics. This is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Centre. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking for suggestions of volunteers as well as donations. Please ask Dr. Mahabir for details. I'm sure you've all seen that news unfold on the war between Israel and Palestine, and we thought we would take a short moment to say that we hope and pray that this violence ends and is resolved peacefully. So now, ladies and gentlemen, our moderator this evening is Shakira Mohammed, who has a BA in Business Management and a Bachelor's in Education degree with a focus on special needs education. She has been a teacher for the past 15 years. Shakira, welcome.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you for sharing today. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste, and a warm welcome to all of you. And thank you for choosing to be here with us. This public meeting for today or tonight will take the form of a panel discussion followed by questions and comments from members of the audience. The entire program should not last more than 2 hours. So this meeting is being recorded live and will be uploaded later on YouTube permanently for posterity. This meeting is also being live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and we want to welcome all our viewers on YouTube. So to avoid intrusions from trolls, Raven Ram saying our IT manager has muted everyone. Speakers, please do not admit anyone, do not unmute anyone, and do not allow anyone to share your screen. Thank you for your cooperation. Our program today is entitled Chinese Indentureship and Identity in the Caribbean. So during a 26-year period between 1853 and 1879, approximately 18,000 Chinese laborers were imported to the British Caribbean as part of an indentureship scheme to work on sugar plantations in British Guyana, now called Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica. Most of them from Guyana later migrated to Trinidad and Suriname. Chinese persons were also brought to Spanish, French, and Dutch-speaking countries in the Western Hemisphere. After the United States and Cuba and Peru combined, the English-speaking Caribbean formed the third largest Chinese diaspora in the Western world. Why were Chinese laborers brought to the Caribbean before and during Indian indentureship? Were they treated the same way as Indian indentured laborers? What were the terms and conditions of their bonded labor? Why did they not remain in agriculture? What was the nature of their intentions, if any at all, with other ethnic groups? Were they able to manage to retain their religion, traditions, and language? These and other questions will be addressed by our panel of international speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, our first speaker today or tonight is Earl Mingus Bouquet of St. Lucia. He's a journalist and the president of the St. Lucia China Friendship Association. He has worked with local, regional, and international media for 47 years as a writer and broadcaster. So welcome, sir. You may speak now for about 15 minutes. Are you able to unmute, sir? Mr. Earl? Robin, will you be able to help him?
Yes, I have unmuted. Sorry about that.
You can go ahead
Is
for 15 minutes. Welcome,
that
sir.
okay now? Yes, yes. Thank you. And it's both pleasing and matter of joy to be here this afternoon. I want to apologize for whatever disturbance in the background. I live close to a community activity for World Food Day tomorrow, me 2 hours from the paid activity. So I'm hoping that we will be able to cover it this afternoon. I will look at first of all, I will offer you an introduction and preface or forward to my presentation. Then I will look at Chinese in the Caribbean and the world today. We look at the issue of who came to the Caribbean first, the issue of decolonization of our minds. I'll talk about how they, meaning the Chinese, came before Columbus. Then we look at contributions of CARICOM citizens of Chinese origin, historically and today. And we looked at harnessing the growing Chinese Caribbean connection. And finally, where we could be looking at in the period leading to 2039 and 2049, which are actually the two very important anniversaries in China, the centenary of the Republic and the centenary of the initiation of Chinese immigration abroad. Now, I'm not one who navigates the World Wide Web on Facebook or Instagram, Twitter or X, but I do Google and consult in search of what I may need by way of basic facts and figures from which to build and construct the thousands of articles I've been producing in the latter half of my 47-year career as a Caribbean journalist, also interested in global affairs, like in this case, the issue of the Chinese migration in the Caribbean, but not from the standpoint of beginning to end, but from the beginning of China's presence in the Caribbean and the wider region to present, largely bypassing the intervening period that I am sure other presenters will address during today's session. In the process, I will look at China's naval presence in the Caribbean, which preceded Columbian times, just as Africans were also in this part of the world before Columbus. I will then skip the centuries from 1421 to 1992, 500 years after Columbus's death, when evidence emerged that a Chinese explorer was here in this part of the world at least 70 years before Columbus. And I will invite us to consider whether the descendants of the early and the earliest Chinese immigrants in the Caribbean and the world are today as we speak. Now, I will also close with an indication of my own thinking in terms of the Chinese presence in and relationship with CARICOM and the wider Caribbean and Latin American region today, in the age when the old Silk land and maritime road has given way to the new bricks and mortar global realities of China's role in the collective leadership of the BRICS grouping and the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, in 2023. My little bit of selective and general online research for this afternoon before putting this paper together offered the following answers to some of the inquiries raised by our opening presenter, or the one who introduced us, and as the host. I will be answering some of those questions about Chinese migration in the Caribbean, which also turned up, and that is my research, similar and different general and specific facts and figures, from which I have chosen only those I think even if slightly inaccurate by way of times and dates, names and numbers, are still historically irrefutable facts. So here are some of the facts and figures I've noted from my admittedly lazy online searches about Chinese migration to the Caribbean and the world. And we looked at, or I did look at, which ethnic group came to the Caribbean first. When did Chinese and Indians come to the Caribbean? The whole issue of Chinese in the Caribbean and the world today. And in that regard, I would prefer to be able to address those issues as we move along and instead proceed to that aspect where we look at, in any historical review, who came first. And all that said, I am, like I said, not one to discuss or debate who discovered the world or the Americas or the Caribbean, is simply because we all know that no one, not even the proverbial and biblical Adam and Eve, could ever have discovered anywhere on planet Earth a place in the universe that preceded humankind. But the claims of who went where first have lived and grown with human civilization from day one, which actually has no date, never mind the age of the earth, starting in Christian calendar teachings on Christmas Day 2022 years ago. Of course, with over 5,000 years of its history recorded, China can trace its past twice further than the birth of Christ. The same with the issue of who supposedly discovered the Caribbean and the Americas, with the Europeans teaching the rest of the world that Christopher Columbus opened the way to this part of the world when he landed in Haiti, quite by accident, admittedly, in 1492. Now, that accidental landing on the island Columbus called Hispaniola led to the group of neighboring islands being christened the West Indies, because he, Columbus, thought he had landed on islands in Western India, the western part of India, and hence the name West Indies. Now, Columbus's supposed discovery of Haiti, according to European historians, opened the way for Europe to civilized, ungodly natives whose older and more advanced civilizations the Europeans destroyed through native genocide, with papal blessing from the Vatican, arriving on ships with crosses on their sails and blessed by the Vatican's doctrine of discovery declared 5 centuries ago. The doctrine of discovery was a papal bull that gave Christian explorers the blessing in the name of their sovereign to lay claim to territories uninhabited by Christians. But never mind, the doctrine was renounced earlier this year, 2023, by the first non-European Pope, who also hails from a land that suffered the consequences of the 500-year-old papal bull. Positive as this renunciation is, it does not in any way erase the destructive or the destruction of the native civilizations of the first people of this region in the name of the church, in the name of the Father, and on behalf of whatever sovereign. Yet, even while we reject the notion of discovery, the reality behind the claim resulted in over 570 years of European occupation, execution, and assimilation in this part of the world through slavery and all of its offshoots, from so-called emancipation to so-called apprenticeship, through to indentureship, and the continuing colonial relationship that still exists across the Caribbean's island chain and dotting the Caribbean Sea today. This is why CARICOM nations, for the first time in history by any regional grouping, are today demanding reparations for slavery and native genocide from European states that built empires and profited from transatlantic slavery. In terms of decolonization of our minds, we have to see that the accumulated effect of slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism and imperialism led to fabricated forms of statehood and independence that have for 6 decades maintained the dependence on former colonial so-called mother countries. But even while the struggle continues today to decolonize the minds of the majority of Caribbean citizens, the struggle also continues to right the wrong information embedded in our collective minds over time. Decolonization of Caribbean minds is a continuous process that saw early Caribbean writers like Amy Césaire and Frantz Fanon, pioneers like Marcus Garvey and W. Arthur Lewis, C.L.R. James and Walter Rodney, and others, making the direct connection between Africa and the Caribbean before and after slavery through colonialism to independence. In 1976, Guyanese historian Ivan van Sertima wrote the classic book entitled They Came Before Columbus, a detailed and compelling account through detailed documentation of the presence and legacy of Africans in ancient America long before Columbus. Clearly, Africans came before Columbus, but so did Chinese, which is still a widely published and well-proven fact, but hardly acknowledged by historians and researchers. But it's all documented in a book entitled 1421, The Year China Discovered the World. I repeat the title, 1421, The Year China Discovered the World. And it is written by Gavin Menzies, G-A-V-I-N-M-E-N-Z-I-E-S, and it is described on the cover as the international bestseller that is rewriting history. It's available online. By Menzies' detailed account, Zhen He, a Chinese navigator, arrived in these parts in 1421, all of 70 years before Columbus, at a time when the debate was already raging on whether the world was flat or round, and explorers seeking new worlds to conquer secretly followed maps and routes of those who preceded them. Explorers used early Chinese maps as well as maps of Marco Polo's routes in Asia. And the explorer, he was also aided by his own predecessors from other parts of the world. So as the world observed the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's death on May 20th in 2006, he died in 1506, a prominent and respected Chinese corporate lawyer named Lu Gang, L-U-G-A-N-G, and Gavin Menzies, who I just mentioned, who is also a British historian and a former submarine commander in the British Royal Navy. The two combined their unique historical treasures to make the still undisputed but also yet to be acknowledged claim that while Columbus was credited with having discovered the world for Europe, a little known but highly accomplished Chinese navigator, Zhen He, had been to this part of the world as far back as 1421. Now, the lawyer Gang had bought a certified genuine map of the world drawn over 7 decades before 1492, when Columbus was supposed to have discovered the world. Menzies' account is detailed in the book I just mentioned, which was published in 2002. And like I said earlier, today's historians and libraries of world history have failed or refused or are simply unwilling to challenge or acknowledge. So the fact is that Africans and Chinese came to the Caribbean and the Americas before Columbus, but the subsequent European conquest of new lands in the name of Christendom also resulted in Africans and Chinese brought to the region through slavery and indentureship being marginalized minorities in later times, as well as in these times. Yet, while the contributions of Chinese and Indian indentured laborers have been understated, it is a fact that their status as discriminated and or marginalized persons also led to an enforced sense of solidarity and created needs for being able to carve out their own special niches in whatever local markets they arrived at or grew up in. Now, this is a common feature among marginalized immigrant minorities everywhere that's seen. Most end up moving up and ahead in local business and entrepreneurship quicker than the average local critic. So while Caribbean people of Indian descent have been subjected to racial, ethnic, or other negative attacks, they have tended to stand out in whatever commercial practices they engage in any and everywhere. Likewise, our Caribbean citizens of Chinese origin, descendants of Indian indentured laborers, are now being categorized by some as having suffered less at the hands of slave masters who engaged them to keep the wheels of fortune turning, and therefore not worthy of representation for reparations, as with CARICOM's call for reparations for from Europe for slavery and native genocide. Chinese too have borne the same brunt of racial and ethnic minority criticism and discrimination in Caribbean societies, traditionally mainly thought of as simply restaurant owners and providers of cheap and more affordable labor, fast-selling dry goods, or as associated with traditional North American Chinese laundry labels. These descendants of the original Chinese immigrants and indentured servants have made marks more than their size in the Caribbean nations where they are part of the society today. The smaller islands of the Caribbean also have proportionate sizes of local-born Chinese, including islands like St. Lucia and the non-English speaking Caribbean territories that still fly European and American flags in the Caribbean. And in each case, they also live with the local culture, which their parents and grandparents adopted and adapted to, also speaking whatever is the local tongue or indigenous language. Today, folks, therefore, there is a growing generation of Caribbean citizens of Chinese descent who've grown up as nationals of whatever nation in CARICOM, state or colony that they grew up in, even though most still continue to be described first as Chinese than whatever Caribbean nation they were born in. Same with the growing list of Caribbean nationals post-indentureship and arrival of Indian descent, Syrian descent, and Lebanese and Arab descent, Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi descent, also born where they live and do business. Chinese have maintained the immigrant minority tradition of keeping the business within the family or the clan by selling or passing on businesses only or mainly to others in the wider family, practices well known across the region. In fact, in some larger and smaller CARICOM and Caribbean nations and states, nationals or citizens of Chinese origin dominated the pioneering of supermarket businesses and today are owners of shopping malls and other merchandising outlets, while today's youth of Chinese origin in the Caribbean attend the same schools and seek the same jobs after graduation as everyone else. And this is a relatively new feature in the smaller islands where new generations are part of every aspect of the society. So as I start to conclude, we point out that many areas where Caribbean people of Chinese origin have scored accomplishments have been traditionally ignored or understated, from politics to banking to dance hall and reggae music. And Jamaicans of Chinese origin are still even less so culturally ridiculed in song by calypso, mento, dancehall, etc. But they did make significant contributions to the music industry in Jamaica, as with Byron Lee, whose contribution was Caribbean and global. The Chinese Caribbean reality today is one where there are more citizens of original Chinese origin than many or most of their fellow Caribbean citizens would know or realize in all aspects of life, from restaurants and supermarkets to tourism, banking, and all the commanding heights of national economies in several CARICOM member states. So, harnessing of that existing foundation of Caribbean and American existence 2 centuries after the first immigration following Jean He's historic passage through the region, and 26 years before the transition of the People's Republic of China to socialism with Chinese characteristics, it is essential that China's progress towards modernization be seen as an example to the rest of the world. So the year 2039, just 1 minute, please. The year 2039 is only 16 short years away, and ahead of the 200th anniversary of the official recordings of the arrival of Chinese quoted earlier, it is necessary that an important part of the Chinese arrival and presence in the Caribbean, in this part of the world, be placed in historical perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, sir. We did take your time with your 20 minutes, and that was really very insightful and very articulate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Questions and comments from the audience at the end of all the presentations. So, ladies and gentlemen, we would now like to introduce our second speaker for today or tonight, who is Dr. Anne-Marie Lee Loy of Canada, originally from Jamaica. She is the Associate Dean at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her book entitled Searching for Mr. Chin explores how Chinese have been depicted in Jamaican, Trinidadian, and Guyanese fiction. So welcome, Dr. Lee Loy. You can speak for about 15 minutes.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to be part of this panel. Really looking forward to that. Just a little bit of correction. I actually was not born in Jamaica. I would love to claim that I was born in Jamaica, but I was born and raised in Canada, quite near to Niagara Falls, if you know the area. Okay. So I have been asked to speak specifically to Chinese indentured experience in Jamaica. I'm going to constrain my comments to that. Of course, though, I'd like to give you a little bit of a context in the broadest sense. So in the broadest sense, of course, the Chinese who came to Jamaica were really part of that phenomenon, that massive out-migration of Chinese that occurred in the 19th century all around the world. And they were driven by a combination of factors, which for brevity's sake, I'll just say, included things like economic hardship, natural disaster, a weak imperial government, and of course, civil unrest and interethnic conflict, not least of which was the Taiping Rebellion and the Opium Wars. So what brought them to the West Indies, and when I say West Indies, I'm really speaking about British Guyana, that then called British Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, was the colonial government's attempt to shore up the sugar industry and to maintain the social order in the wake of the passing of the Sugar Duties Act and the wake of the abolition of slavery. So from the 18th century onward, we really see the Chinese represented as being a particularly well-suited community to meet both of those concerns. First, as both a tireless and docile source of industry, which is kind of funny, as we'll see later. And then second, as creating a type of buffer zone between the planter class and the newly freed Black peasantry. Nevertheless, despite the twofold recommendation, as our moderator has said, of the 18,000 or so Chinese indentured laborers who entered the West Indies in the 19th century, it was really just a small pittance that would come into Jamaica, probably around 1,200. Now, although the first Chinese indentured laborers did not arrive in Jamaica until 1854, there was a lot of prior discussion about whether Chinese indentured laborers should be introduced, if at all, and if so, under what conditions. So in the 1840s, post-emancipation, there was serious investigations by what was called the Colonial Land and Immigration Commission into this topic. And an important part of this topic was how to ensure that the Chinese indentured laborers coming to the West Indies were coming of their own free will. It was an important question to the colonial government because by this time, there was a lot of demand for Chinese labor. And the recruitment of Chinese in China had actually developed or evolved around a system of contractors or agents. They were actually called crimps, who were paid a fee for each of the Chinese laborers that they were able to procure. So obviously it was a system that was open to a lot of abuse. And certainly by the 19th century, it had become notorious for deceit, for trickery, for fraud, for kidnapping that the crimps were using to deliver Chinese to the ships that would take them abroad. So as late as 1872, you would find an article in the London and China Telegraph that describes the system as one of rapacity, violence, and dishonesty of the emigration agencies and the vileness of the native instruments set in motion by the capital of foreigners to entrap or kidnap Chinese who had no desire to emigrate at all. So having only recently abolished slavery, the colonial government was obviously very anxious not to be seen as perpetrating a new form of slavery. And so they developed a highly regulated system of recruitment that was based really on immigration houses and immigration agents that were posted in China. And in addition to stipulating the terms of the contract, the system included such measures as interviewing Chinese to ensure that they actually wanted to come out of China. They enlisted Chinese missionaries missionaries to China and Chinese officials to give validity to the recruitment. And there certainly was a large number of ordinances and regulations controlling every step of the process, or trying to control every step of the process. Whether or not they were actually followed is a totally different story. So it was under this system that the Chinese indentured laborers actually arrived in Jamaica. Now, in 1852, Mr. James White was appointed as an immigration agent in China with the responsibility of managing Chinese indentured immigration to the West Indies. And subsequent to organizing 3 shiploads of immigrants to Trinidad, he turned his attention to Jamaica. And in 1854, he was able to charter a clipper called the SS Epsom and organize the first shipload of Chinese indentured laborers for Jamaica. Now, White's recruitment of the laborers, according to his report, did not happen without some excitement. He reported that in the attempt to subvert the crimps, what he had told the new recruits was that they would not be paid the bonus. They got a bonus for signing their contracts. He said they would not receive that bonus until they actually boarded the ship, the Epsom, which was actually anchored some ways out in the harbor. So the crimps, realizing that the recruits would be getting their money away from them, I think there's a lovely Victorian phrase, the crimps would be prevented from purloining a portion of the advances. So they started this rumor that there was actually manacles and fetters, and they were really taking the Chinese into slavery, which caused a huge confusion and chaos, and many of the Chinese left at that time. But White, as he said, persevered, and he was able to secure eventually just over 300, primarily Cantonese and Fukien, able-bodied agricultural laborers. He also goes on to mention that he included about half a dozen individuals who were not agricultural laborers, but he included them because they could speak English, and he thought that would be useful in Jamaica. So he went on to appoint individuals to act as cooks and headmen and barbers on the journey. The Epsom left China in 1854 and arrived in Falmouth about 3 months later, with 260 laborers or so, who were then allotted to estates in Clarendon and Camanus. So White concluded his report with the claim that this first experiment of emigration from Hong Kong may therefore be considered successful. But it's not quite clear that the planters in Jamaica who received the indentured laborers would agree, at least not unequivocally. Some contemporaries complained that the Chinese who came actually were not very good at cane cutting, and so the wages they were being paid were too high for the amount of work they were producing. Others found the Chinese to be annoyingly querulous in their insistence that the stipulations of their contracts be observed. And then there was a lot of reports of absenteeism and complaints that the Chinese were being absent for really minor indispositions. Now, in November that year, the Epson batch of laborers were joined by another group of Chinese indentured laborers who had been recruited from Panama. The number of Chinese who came from Panama is really in dispute. A lot of historians put the number at 200, like Walter Lookley, for example. But the earliest Chinese historians, Lee Tom Yin and H. Lynch Campbell, for example, of the Chinese in Jamaica, the historians of Chinese in Jamaica have put that number at 472, a number that I've also seen in an article that was in the Kingston Gleaner. So we're not quite sure what the exact number is. I kind of think maybe they added the 200 or so that came from Panama, and maybe the 200 or so that survived the trip from China directly, and came up with that number. But whatever the case is, everyone is in agreement that the Chinese who came from Panama were very, very in poor health. Many of them were just admitted to the hospital upon their arrival. Now, while some of the Chinese in the 1854 group were said to be getting on satisfactorily on the estates, basically the group as a whole began to be known for desertion and disputes with planters. So one observer complained that the immigrants performed as little labor as they possibly could. Disputes arose, complaints were made on both sides. In some cases, the Chinese of their own accord absconded and came to town. In others, the planters, deeming it fruitless to summon them for breach of contract, just discharged them from service. So many of these immigrants would end up around Kingston, a Spanish town, where they would be accused of vagrancy and begging. There was one interesting response to the situation, and this was actually one of the interpreters, as translators who had come on the Epson. He had suggested that the Jamaican government invest in setting up a settlement for the Chinese and encouraging them to farm. They actually did try it. It was about 20 or so Chinese seemed to have decided to participate, but ultimately that settlement failed. And so by 1896, the 1854 migrations were basically being deemed a failure. Now, after 1854, it would take 5 years before Chinese indentured laborers would return to the West Indies. The high point of indentured labor, of course, is generally understood to be 1859 to 1866. During this period, it's unclear whether any Chinese indentured laborers actually entered Jamaica. We can't find an actual ship in the official records coming from China, for example, bringing Chinese laborers in that period. But again, the early historians who were writing in the 1950s and actually speaking to people who claimed to be descendants of these people do say that there was another incoming group of Chinese, at least in the 1860s, possibly from Trinidad and British Guyana, well, most likely, well, from Trinidad and British Guyana, and then possibly also including migrants from Panama and Hawaii. Certainly by 1870, however, there appears to be a revitalized interest in recruiting the Chinese to Jamaica. And so once again, we find language that's quite similar to what we saw at the beginning of the 1800s, where the Chinese are being described as the best of immigrants. They are honestly and uniformly willing to work for their wages. They are docile, patient, apt, and thrifty, and so on. Another factor for this revitalized interest was the ongoing decline of the sugar industry in Jamaica, which was being blamed on labor shortages, especially since a lot of native Jamaicans were going to Panama to work in the canal. So there was one individual in 1880, I saw an article in a newspaper who had said that, there's 300 abandoned sugar estates in Jamaica. And he says that part of the problem is that Negroes, to use his words, can live by working only 1 day a week. So in contrast, he says that coolies and he means Indians and Chinese, have much more staying qualities as laborers than natives. Now, I should mention that in the 1870s, it was not consistent that people wanted the Chinese to be reintroduced. There was a number of voices who did not want them to come back on the grounds of their moral character and the influence, and also just the belief that here and there, Chinese labor is a good workmen, but they didn't feel that they were going to be totally satisfactory to their employers. But nevertheless, by 1884, there's already a notice being circulated by the immigration agent in Hong Kong. They published the full notice here in the Daily Gleaner in Kingston. They published it because they wanted to avoid misunderstandings, which is interesting. You can see the provisions here included such things as their pay, the medical treatment, their housing, which is supposed to be free. And then at the ends of 5 years, they would receive a certificate of industrial service, which entitled them to follow any occupation they please. They'd also appointed a protector of immigrants for Jamaica, Mr. Philip Cork, already. So by 1884, they were all set to receive the last batch of indentured immigrants to Jamaica. So over 600 Chinese indentured laborers disembarked from the Prince Alexander in Kingston in July of 1884. They were sent primarily to estates in St. Thomas and St. Mary. Had not been a smooth journey. They'd actually started off on another ship called the SS Diamond that was damaged in a typhoon, and then they were switched over to the Prince Alexander. Now, like the 1854 indentured immigrants, the new Chinese were also had a reputation for being difficult and for deserting the estates. Barely a year after their arrival, I found this article in the Daily Gleaner, which talks about five imported celestials who, after ransacking the barracks of their countrymen, stealing their money, jewelry, and clothing, took off from the estate where they were located in St. Thomas. They only got away for a day. Apparently, the chase involved scouts and dogs and some sort of brief battle, but they were apprehended within a day and they were brought back or marched back to the estates. And I just bring that to your attention because at the very end of that article, as you can see, it's saying that the desertions are becoming quite common. So in fact, the following month, it was reported that of the Chinese immigrants, there was at least over officially 175 deserters, of which just under 100 had not been reapprehended. And 1 year later, the Kingston Gleaner was still reporting about the number of deserters from the estates and commenting that they were all congregating around Kingston. The 1884 indentured laborers were also not averse to turning to violence to assert their rights. Andrew Lynn records this case at Gray's Inn, where the Chinese assaulted a policeman that had come, the police had come to arrest and imprison some of other Chinese workers, and the disturbance came so great they had to actually call in the military to try to put it down. Another occasion, there was a sit-down strike. It's described at another estate called Tuckenfield Sugar Estates. They were protesting the 12-hour workday. In response, the estate owners, they love to do this, the divide and conquer strategy. They sent in some about 60 Negroes, they said, and I think over 100 East Indians to try to force the Chinese back to work. And all that happened was big chaos, big melee. One of the Negro workers was killed, and at least many others were injured, including 7 Chinese. In fact, so disruptive were the Chinese, the 1884 group, that when the immigration department was actually questioned about their costs, one of their defenses for not reducing their staff was the claim that they were needed due to the recent arrival of the Chinese and the trouble they have given. So, of course, it's not to say that there are not some Chinese immigrants who were actually fulfilling the terms of their contracts on the estates. So if you look in the Daily Gleaner, you'll see Philip Cork regularly announcing that they have time off for Chinese New Year's. I found some listing of public auctions of estates that make mentions of small numbers of Chinese that are working at the estates. And indeed, in the 1800s, the protective immigrant that we saw, Philip Cork, had noted that the Chinese coolie continues to perform satisfactory work. They are more hardy than East Indians. The mortality amongst them is less. But then again, here is the problem. So large a number have deserted from their estates that their usefulness as indentured laborers has been materially curtailed. So this consistent movement away from laboring on the estates or rejecting of estate work is perhaps the most common feature of Chinese indentured labor in Jamaica, so much so that by 1891, which is really only 2 years after the 1884 group, well, a few years after the 1884 group should have finished their contracts, there was only about 6% of the Chinese population in Jamaica still in St. Thomas and St. Mary, and 61% were in Kingston and Port Royal. So if In conclusion, the intention of introducing Chinese indentured laborers to Jamaica in the 19th century was to establish a community of rural laborers who would provide a stable and docile workforce for the plantations. And then I think we can say that the indentured experience was an unmitigated failure. Nevertheless, the period of Chinese indentured labor in Jamaica is significant because it would have long-lasting impact on Jamaica, including on families like my own. And so it should not be considered as a mere blip in the historical record. Chinese indenture set the foundation for the shape of the Chinese community in the 20th century, particularly in their ability to dominate the retail industry, a direction that they had already been moving towards since the earliest days of indenture. So after all, from the 1854 group, one of the immigrants would set up a really successful wholesale business that would become highly influential and play an integral role in helping other immigrants set up their businesses. The founders of many of the Chinese institutions, such as the old age home, they came in 1884, and I will just say that in conclusion, what was I going to say? That again, they were going to be a highly Hakka-dominated community, highly male community, so there was a lot of mixed-race children who were born. The way they practiced their business practices, because the Hakka were very ethnically exclusive, I guess, or they were perceived as ethnically exclusive community that would send out back to the villages and bring young men over to work in the shops. That really also shaped the way that Jamaicans perceived the Chinese as an exclusive community, which would then cause problems in the 20th century sometimes. So thank you.
Thank you so very much. That was so very insightful and very interesting. And you were on time. Thank you. Just a couple minutes afterwards. All right. So now we would continue with our third speaker. And that would be Dr. Mark Tunbridge of Guyana, originally from England. He's a lecturer at the University of Guyana with research interests in Caribbean literature and culture, world literature, and literary representations of slavery, indentureship, opium, and sugar. So welcome, sir. You have 15 minutes, about 15 minutes. I'm giving everybody extra time though.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Mahabir for asking me to come along this afternoon and speak about Chinese indentureship. And I'd also like to recognize Dr. David Dabby-Dean in the audience as well, my supervisor, my PhD mentor and friend. And I should also recognize my VC as well, Paloma Mohammed, Professor Paloma Mohammed in the audience as well. So protocols having been established, I will proceed. I'm going to set a timer going just so I can keep on time. I think I might actually go under time, but we'll see. We'll see how I get on. So I need to share my screen. Share screen. So what I'd like to focus on today, you should now all be seeing my screen. What I'd like to focus on today, here's my plan. I'd like to take a broad view across a number of identities and think about, in doing that, and think about identity, you know, take that as a kind of model to think about representations of Chinese subjects in the Caribbean. So I want to use dress, hair and appearance as markers of identity. And I'm going to use one source for that. I then want to think about gender, particularly women and homosexuality. My response to that in thinking about them is really the important thing for me here is to think about how the plantocracy in Guyana then respond to these issues. Okay, how it emerges in the archive, how these issues emerge in the archive. And and the British Guyana's response, right, to these issues. So I'm going to be using two sources, one from literature, a novel, and another, the archive. So to start with the source from literature, I'm going to be looking at Christina Garcia's wonderful novel, Monkey Hunting, which the cover is now on screen for you. And I thoroughly recommend this. And her writing, generally speaking, is top rate, right? She's a really good novelist. She's Cuban by birth. She now lives in the States, in Miami. And this is, as far as I know, this is the only novel that completely kind of focuses on Chinese indentureship. There are other novels that focus on Chinese subjects, right, that have Chinese subjects in the Caribbean, you know, the presence of you know, subjects and characters in the novels. But this is the only one that I'm aware of that focuses its attention on that whole kind of system and takes a view from beginning to end on that subject, right? So if anyone, I'm really interested, if anyone knows of any other novels that do that, right, then please let me know. Okay. So this is going to be my source for my first issue, which is this idea of dress and hair. Okay. And obviously one of the things that, one of the kind of markers of identity generally, and particularly when it comes to race, right, is hair, and no less with the Chinese indentureship experience. So on screen now you have a quotation here from Garcia's novel, okay, and you notice this is quite early on in the novel, and a reference to the protagonist, which is Chen Pan. His hair was tied back in a thick queue, and then I've included this painting from George Chinnery, the British artist who spent a lot of time in China and painted a lot of Chinese subjects, and I thoroughly recommend his work to you. And here's a recently auctioned pen and ink drawing of this Chinese gentleman with the queue in place. Okay, and it's that kind of that hairdo that I'm really interested in, and its significance, right, because it's highly symbolic and kind of politically important as well. So when the migrants, Chen Pan then is basically signs the indentureship papers while he's high on opium, and we could have a whole conversation about opium and indentureship. So he signs the papers, indentures himself to Cuba. He's put on then a British boat. Okay, it's a British boat that takes him to Cuba, not Spanish. And when he arrives in Cuba, okay, we then get this comment here: several landowners tried to cut off the queues of their hires. Those who protested were beaten. Chen Pan was relieved that his employer didn't insist upon this, so he's able to keep his queue in place. Others then forcibly have their queues cut off. Now this kind of haircut is important because Dr. Leloy mentioned the Taiping Rebellion in her presentation, and those that were loyal to the Mandarins, so to the ruling class, were had the queue. Okay, so if you had a queue, then it shows your allegiance to the Mandarins and you know, to China. Okay. Certainly, you know, that as I say, that class of Mandarins. If you were part of the Taiping Rebellion, okay, then your allegiance wouldn't be to the Mandarins, and you would have a short haircut, right? You'd probably either, you know, have longer hair, but you wouldn't have that queue. It would be, you know, you'd grow your hair longer all over, right? So you would have stood out, right? And so cutting off your queue it's a really big deal, okay, for these Chinese indentured laborers, because they see it as so intrinsically part of, you know, what they're about and their you know, their national allegiance, as it were. And here they are having them, you know, cut off by the planters, right? As the novel then goes along, it then recognizes, right, that a few Chinese adopt Spanish names and cut off their own cues, right, and adapt their palates to the local food. So here then is this idea that, you know, aside from the landowners actually cutting their hair off, they're actually doing it themselves. So they're then recognizing this sense of transition, right, in their own identity, and kind of recognizing the place that they're in, and maybe that this is no longer important to them. So they cut it off themselves. And Chen Pan does this, right, as part of that, as part of his own transition. And you notice how the page numbers are progressing here. And then we get this quotation from page 55 in the novel. A Chino like Chen Pan in a white suit, a white linen suit and a Panama hat was something of a spectacle, like a talking monkey or a sheep in evening dress. Okay, so here Chen Pan has then made the transition into this white linen suit. You can imagine this kind of you know, quintessential Spanish planter the kind of dress, right, the white linen suit and the Panama hat. But here is this Chinese, formerly, by this time he's a former indentured laborer. He's freed himself from that system, and he's now dressing like a kind of Spanish bourgeois, right? Notice that the chino, okay, this is a kind of derogatory way of referring to Chinese in Cuba, and the vision of him, you know, like a talking monkey or a sheep in evening dress, is kind of what you're getting there is the colonizer's view of this man, because here's this kind of Chinese man dressed in this way, so they would see him, you know, in this, you're kind of getting their vision, right, rather than a Chinese one. By the end of the novel then, Chen Pan is sat in front of his antique shop wearing a wide-sleeved shirt and pantaloons. His hair was fine and white and tied in a queue. So he's now gone back, okay? He's kind of reverted right towards the end of the novel, back to this Chinese identity of the queue and the dress, rather than going back, you know, rather than staying in the linen suit. He's now gone back to that kind of traditional kind of Chinese dress. So what I want you to kind of get here is this idea of identity as a transition, and we could take, you know, numerous different parts of Garcia's novel, you know, different themes, and see this kind of cycle, this idea of a sort of process or a circle, okay, is really, really strong in her work, and I think it chimes with identity and the way identity is viewed, certainly from a theoretical perspective. Okay, so I now want to move away from Garcia's novel and go to think about this other source that I've picked on. And it's really quite interesting that Dr. Leloy picked on two references in her presentation, one to Berkeley, one to Governor Berkeley, I think she made, and also to White, and I'm going to come back to both of them, so there's a kind of chime there. But I want really to focus on Dr. Edward Eli's journal, which comes from on the right hand side. You've got the top page of the extracts, the colonial documents that are present at Kew in the UK. So Eli is a surgeon on board the Samuel Boddington, okay, the ship, okay, which brought Chinese labourers to British Guyana on the 17th of January, arrives on the 17th of January, 1853. So he's the surgeon on board. But interestingly enough, he's also the American consul to Bombay, right? So there's this interesting kind of link between America, India, China, okay, and then the Caribbean, all right? And that's a really important kind of lift. By his own words, then he has this significant kind of dealings with China, and I think he's quite a sort of shady character. I have a notion, right, that he's involved in the opium trade, but I can't prove that. But all the kind of evidence is there, you know, the kind of connections, circumstantial evidence, certainly, right? So I want to think about this idea of homosexuality, and in his journal, which is part of these, part of the extracts in this parliamentary paperwork, he picks up on a number of, well, at least if he's to be believed, he picks up on a number of these homosexual relationships going on the boat on the way over. This then causes, because it is then, you know, comes out in the paperwork, there's this reaction, and it's that reaction that I'm really interested in. Okay, it's the way that the colonial agents then respond to this situation. Okay, and here is Berkeley, Sir Henry Berkeley, responding, okay, so reading Eli's work and then responding to what he's reading, and what when he says one point in this quotation, that's what he's talking about, are these relationships that are going on board on the boat. So he says, in conclusion, there is one point adverted to in Dr. Eli's journal which will scarcely bear to be enlarged upon, but which it would be a false delicacy altogether to ignore, especially as it confirms the urgent necessity of procuring at the earliest possible period a certain proportion of Chinese women for this colony. Okay, so the response then is the recognition that there are few women actually coming over to the Caribbean on these boats, and that they need to get women into the colony, right? And of course, the problem here is that there's two things. One is that I've moved the slide on here to a letter that Eli then writes back to Berkeley in his request to kind of respond to his request to get women, right? He then refers to the strict prohibitory laws of the empire. So this is the Mandarins have this law, you know, against women leaving China, and I think it's also culturally kind of taboo, right, for women to leave China at this time. We're talking about the middle of the 19th century, and there are so few. When you look at the numbers in China, I know I'm getting close to time, right, so I'm gonna try and gallop along. When you look at the numbers of people in you know, in China, there's so huge majority that there's kind of 230,000 Chinese that go, you know, that emigrate to make that journey to Cuba, and if there's, you know, like 100 women there, I think that would be a lot, right? That have, you know, made the journey over from China. Okay, so So he says, Eli says, the laws are not enforced when the embarkation is not too publicly conducted. And then he says he sees no problem in obtaining a number of girls and young women, say 600, who can be voluntarily engaged at once if the vigilance of the mandarins may be avoided. Now how you're not too publicly going to get 600 women on a boat, I don't know how you're going to do that, but clearly he's got something in mind, right? And then he talks about, you know, the sort of makeup of these women, what he thinks they're going to be. His expectation is gardeners, boat women, the most numerous, he says, wash women, fishermen's daughters, he says, the lower classes of Chinese women who are regarded as little better than slaves at home. But they will be well formed and accustomed to manual labor. Right, so you can see just how these you know, let alone the men that are coming over, how, you know, their plans are actually getting women, right, to come over because they're seeing these relationships on board the boat. One last thing, and this is a reference to White, who Dr. Leloy also referred to. So he then refers then to that they're possessed of strong animal passions. This is the Chinese indentured labourers, right? I'm afraid they, the male Chinese migrants, may become sullen and discontented unless they should form connections with the Negro women. But if this difficulty can be overcome, they will be found cheerful, contented, and industrious, which is very similar to those kind of ideas of, you know, in Dr. Leloy's presentation, that, you know, they'll be pliable and okay, and they go about their business quietly. Okay, so on that note, I will say thank you very much. I will leave you with my references. I've given you the reference for Eli's journal in the parliamentary papers. I've given you the reference for monkey hunting. I've also bigged up Anne-Marie Leloy's Searching for Mr. Chin, which is great, right? And then Wally Looklai's work on the Chinese in the West Indies, which also contains an extract from Eli's journal, is actually in that book as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Mark. That was very thought-provoking and educational. So, ladies and gentlemen, we go on to our fourth and final speaker today and tonight is Shalama Mohammed of Trinidad. She's a teacher with a master's in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA, engaged in interdisciplinary research on indentureship and culture. She's also the co-director and the regular moderator of this ICC weekly Sunday Zoom program. So welcome, Shalama. You can speak for about 15 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. I'm not usually speaking for just 15 minutes, but I appreciate it. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Shakir, can you please confirm that you're seeing my screen?
Yeah, I'm seeing your screen. You want to enlarge it?
Yes.
Great.
Okay, good, thank you. So to the other speakers, thank you very much. You've created an excellent introduction for my presentation. And to the audience, there will be some areas of overlap, unfortunately. What I would like to talk about is Chinese indentureship, specifically with regard to Trinidad. And I just want to create a little historical background here. In 1797, the British took over from the Spaniards in Trinidad. Less than a decade later, the Parliament prohibited the slave trade, especially to new territories such as Trinidad. This was also the year, 1806 was the year that we had the first arrivals of Chinese to Trinidad. 1 year later, in 1807, we had the general abolition of the British slave trade. Over the next 27 years or so, we would have had Africans continuing to labor on the plantations, but they were eagerly looking forward to emancipation and then apprenticeship. So that was completed by 1838. 7 years later, in 1845, we have the arrival of the first batch of Indian indentured servants. And 8 years later, in 1853, we had the second set of Asian immigrants come in. There were only 2 sets of Asian indentured servants coming into Trinidad, despite the fact that we would have had indentured servants coming in from Germany, Ireland, Africa as well, and some from Britain itself. So by 1853, we had the beginning of immigration of the indentured Chinese. 13 years later, by 1866, Chinese immigration had ended. Indian immigration, however, would have continued for a further 51 years, ending in 1917. So what I wanted to do, what I thought was interesting to do, was to compare and contrast the 2 different forms of Asian indentureship in Trinidad. And I really wanted to find out as well, why was Chinese indentureship resumed and running concurrently with Indian indentureship? You see, in 1806, that was a very brief experiment. It was actually started by Captain William Layman, who proposed to the colonial office that Trinidad should be developed with free workers who were to be imported from China. So this was not necessarily an indentureship program. This was free workers coming in from China, choosing voluntarily to come. And he worked out the economics of it to justify his proposal. So he suggested that if you have a sugar plantation of about 640 acres, it would be cheaper to establish having just 100 Chinese men as opposed to 250 slaves. So he estimated that it would cost £23,000 less to establish such a plantation, and it would also cost £4,500 less to operate on an annual basis. So he also suggested, based on his experience with Chinese laborers in Penang especially, that they would be ideally suited to the job because they were inured to a hot climate, they were habitually industrious, they were sober, peaceable, frugal, eminently skilled in the culture and preparation of every article of tropical agriculture. But we will see that that would be a little bit problematic later on. By 1809, if you reflect here on the population of Trinidad, you had approximately 20,000 African slaves and free people, numbering 7,675, which was segregated into coloreds, being 5,400, whites 2,274, Amerindians 1,607, but no Chinese mentioned. You see, at the time, Trinidad was a small money economy. It was brutal, it was violent. The slave trade had been, the act to abolish the slave trade was passed in 1807. Planters expected that there would be a labor shortage. But the thing about it was that those Chinese who came in were operating in adverse circumstances. The environment was a problem. Mosquitoes infested everywhere, especially in the rural areas where they were working. And they suffered from common ailments, including malaria, dysentery, typhoid, yellow fever, and cholera. So unfortunately, while Captain Layman would have suggested that they would be appropriate for the environment, it was fatal to newcomers. So was that experiment considered a failure or was it aborted? Well, there are conflicting views. After 1834, the community completely disappears from the census. You see, what happened after 1806 was that from 1807, 61 of them left Trinidad. They went back on the same boat that brought them, which was the Fortitude. 1 year after their arrival, the Chinese government stipend stopped, 17 had died. And this was the continuing trend, leaving and some dying. By 1809, there were fewer than 30 of those Chinese who came, which numbered 194. And In the 1810 census of Trinidad, only 22 Chinese males were mentioned, and they was mentioned as having lived in misery in this area called Cocorite, making their living selling charcoal, oysters, and crabs. So why then did Chinese come back? Well, some of the push factors resulting in their indentureship had to do with the Taiping political and religious rebellion, which Dr. Leloy would have mentioned. The economy was in a state of collapse. There was famine, there was banditry, there was disease. These situations sounded familiar because this is also what the Indians had to undergo. In China, some of them were also prisoners that were sold into indentureship via Hong Kong and Macau. So here we are seeing that there were similar circumstances. So between China and India, you had some similarities in terms of the push and pull factors. What started out as state-regulated recruitment became duplicitous. Their living conditions were similar. There was labor exploitation. Their work ethic, however, was similar, but up to a point. There was linguistic non-proficiency between both groups, such that one report stated that the Chinese and the Indians did not adapt well to the English language. The Africans did a lot better. Both groups were for a time ostracized by other social groups, but stick a pin in there because we need to comment on how the Chinese were actually treated after. The Chinese and the Indians increased the sparse population in Trinidad, and so they were desirable. They were used as weapons as well in the class struggle against the freed blacks. So, what were some of the characteristics of Chinese indentureship? Well, their recruitment was regulated by Britain in the beginning. It was closely monitored by anti-slavery advocates. It was supervised by an official immigration agent, in this case, J. Gardner Austin, and he would have posted up public notices in order to recruit Chinese. So he would have stated, or rather that notice would have stated that there were special magistrates to protect immigrant laborers. Their daily wages were to be 2 to 4 shillings. They would have free housing with a garden, medical attendance, education for children. Sounds really nice. But Kim Johnson, in his book called Descendants of the Dragons, stated that the Chinese came on better terms than did the Indians. Why? Because their workday was supposed to be 7.5 hours, 7.5 hours long, while the Indians were supposed to work for 9 hours. The Chinese received loan advances. And if you were a married man, you would get $20. If you were an unmarried man, you would get $10. No such loan advances for the Indians. They received bounties for bringing their family. So for each Chinese who would bring his wife or adult daughter, he would be paid $20. And for each child, he was paid $5. There was no such bounty for the Indians. Chinese women who came, and yes, there were very few, but Chinese women who eventually started to come had no contractual obligation to work. They were merely obliged to reside on a designated estate for 5 years, which was the term of the contract, and they would be receiving the same benefits as their spouses, which would be housing, food, medical attendance, and so on. Meanwhile, the Indian laborers, the Indian woman, like my great-great-great-great-grandmother, would have had to labor in the fields. The Chinese, however, were not granted a return passage to China, but the Indians were. So there was a little bit of a difference, as was the case with the Indians, in terms of the philosophy of the indentureship contract, but the practice was different. So regulated recruitment was replaced by unscrupulous recruiters called crimps. They lied to these immigrants about the potential for earnings. Similarly, conditions were not so great. In 1853, there's a report of Mary Attic. She would have fled Hong Kong holding a child in each hand and one on her back. She sought refuge at the immigrant depot, where it was discovered that the infant on her back had been beheaded. There was fierce fighting on board the ship, mainly because natives were from different provinces. So the Chinese were not so docile as some people would have liked to believe. And this is probably because they would have been accustomed to fighting, having just experienced that Taiping rebellion, where peasants and miners and so on eventually learned to become soldiers. Some of them obviously would have accepted, those who survived, obviously would have accepted the opportunity to come to a different country under these contracts. With respect to the advance that Chinese immigrants were given, that landed them in heavy debt. And according to the Trinidad Immigration Report of 1862, suicide has been resorted to occasionally as a desirable mode of terminating the industrial contract and repaying the advance. So what was happening on the estates? Well, these Chinese were not as docile. They demanded their legal rights. And there are reports by the immigration agent general that they showed their temper before 3 weeks had passed, refusing to work, insisting on full rations in the terms of their agreements. In many instances, they laid up during 14 days and turned out on the 15th, turning in again on the 16th for the remainder of the month, and then claiming all the privileges of those who had done a full month's work. Obviously, this was not the case with every single Chinese, but there was a substantial amount of them who did this. On the Orange Grove estate in Tacarigua, there's a report that the Chinese refused to complete their allotted task of 25 rods, and on completion of 16 rods, they decided to depart. So the sub-overseer Connolly became irate. He seized a whip from the hands of a carter who was standing close by, let it fly, and cut 2 of the Chinese with the lash. In a short time, he was surrounded by them, armed with cutlasses. And but for the timely assistance of the coolies, the Indians, who came to his rescue, he might not now be living to tell the tale. This was reported in the newspaper, The Herald, in 1853. Well, Connolly, rightfully so, was charged with assault and ordered to pay a fine of $40. But the thing here that I want to point out is that there was a carter standing close by with a whip. You had Chinese and Indians working on this field. If anybody queries whether or not they were beaten or subjected to extremely harsh conditions, I think this would suggest that they were indeed. By 1866, which is the final year of the Chinese indentureship, 2 vessels brought 597 Chinese, 16 unfortunately passed away at sea. And so over the period 1853 to 1866, 8 vessels would have brought Chinese, a very small number. 2,784 would have left China, but 2,645 landed in Trinidad. 146 died and 7 were born at sea. So of that small number, 2,000 odd, in 1866, it was necessary for the prison inspector to list the offenses committed by the Chinese immigrants. Of course, this would have been done frequently, but 1866 was significant. We see that 502 were noted for offenses such as want of certificate, a simple civil offense. 220 breach of contract, a little more significant. 110 for larceny, 13 damage with intent to steal, 8 for assault, 8 for trespassing, 7 resisted a police constable. Then they had stolen property, 6 were, there was the offense of menaces, flying without a license. You would call this entrepreneurial now. They were ill-treating animals as well, and 2 committed the offense of being in debt. 2 introduced tobacco in prison. 2 were held for selling opium without a license, and 2 were held for street obstruction, more than likely because they were probably selling, as Chinese so often do. One was held for obscene language, exposure of person, harboring immigrants, and so on. And the reason why I'm raising this is because some of the laws were really questionable. There were automatic criminal penalties for violations of contractual obligations of a civil nature. And we query whether the indentures were actually informed by the recruiting agents, whether these were regulated agents or whether they were crimps of the existence of these laws in the territory. So here you have people trying to survive, but we don't know to what extent they were aware of the laws. So what was the impact of this phenomenon of immigrant cheap labor? Well, according to Walton Lockley, who could quite possibly be considered the expert on Chinese indentureship in Trinidad, he says wherever the Asians, particularly the Indians, arrived in large or small numbers, their very presence and mode of introduction generated complaints and frequently fierce hostility from those affected by their arrival. And he explained this as being introduced to undermine the perceived gains and social strength of the pre-existing labor force, which would have been the Africans. So what was the situation in terms of race relations? Well, Chinese and Africans enjoyed a less frictional relationship than Indians and Africans. And the reason for this may have had to do with the fact that they were less in number than the Indians. They had a different attitude to the Africans than did the Indians. In fact, there's a report that the Chinese instilled fear in the Africans, while the Indians were frequently bullied by the Africans. In March 1861, a letter was written in which it was stated that not less than 30 Chinese men married Creoles and 17 have families. So by and large, you had a number of Chinese men working in Trinidad who were bachelors, but of those who were married, they intermarried freely with the native women. Chinese women were scarce, you see. And unfortunately, in Trinidad, there was a peculiar problem because these wives who would have come with their Chinese husbands were deserted soon after they arrived. So intermarriage would have taken place, but not necessarily with the Indians. In fact, the Indians were considered too conservative and married according to their caste. So the Chinese were not desirable partners to them. So what were some of the factors that caused Chinese indentureship to come to an end? Both Dr. Leroy and Dr. Tunbridge would have suggested some of these. There was disillusionment among the Chinese with agricultural work, and so they frequently ran away from the estates. Because of this, the planters objected to the continuance of Chinese indentureship. They did not want to have to pay for the high expenses, and it was quite expensive. It was more expensive to bring Chinese indentured immigrants than Indian indentured immigrants, and they did not want to bring them on account that they would run away from work to become future shopkeepers. Once they had finished their 5-year contract, many would have remained. Remember, they did not have return passage to China, and so they would have remained in Trinidad and they would have set up businesses. Because very few of them were able to return to China to speak about the experiences here as indentured immigrants, there were few takers from China. It was also very expensive for the Chinese to return to China, and very few did. The immigration agent was angered about this because there was a loss of promotional opportunities since very few Chinese were returning to China to give account of their experience. And so the Chinese government requested a return passage to be included in the contract, but this was denied. So Chinese indentureship, unfortunately, came to an end in 1866. And I just want to close here by acknowledging both Dr. Kumar Mahaber and Kumaru Ramtahal for seeking out and assisting with resources for this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shalama. I was about to tell you time was up. That was a very well-researched presentation. So we will now take questions and comments from the audience. And you can identify yourself. You can raise your electronic hand. It's at the reactions button at the base of your computer screen. So if there's anyone with questions, please raise your hand. I did see Jay, one of our regulars. He made a comment for our first speaker. So Jay, would you like to bring that? Yes, Raj, I thoroughly enjoyed tonight's presentations also. All right, while we wait for Jay, I see David Subran's hand is up. Please go ahead, sir. Are you able to unmute?
Yes, I can.
Go ahead.
Now, I wonder whether the first presenter checked on the global reviews of the book he cited, Rowan Gavin Menzies, 1421, the year China discovered the world. Because I have been scanning for this book, and reputable historians from all over the world, including China, have all condemned this book, rejecting its theories and claims. One even said it's a hypothesis without any support. Thank you.
Mr. Bousquet, would you like to respond?
Hello, I wouldn't necessarily want to respond except to point out that some of the sources I quoted also included exhibitions supported by the United Nations, supported by China, supported by Latin American countries, where Zheng He was supposed to have been to. And the book also includes material evidence that is available today in places stretching from Ceylon to Brazil. And therefore, as in any case, there will be pros and cons, for and against. Like I said, I'm not into the for and against debate. I'm not into debating who discovered the world, because nobody ever did. And therefore, I wouldn't be drawn into a comment as to the established facts and dates about what he did and led contingents of hundreds of ships and thousands of persons. I also know of historians, not necessarily of our ilk, who have problems with Professor Ivan van Sertima's established account on the fact that Africans from Mali came to Latin America long before Columbus and long before the Chinese. So I will rest my case and not engage in a debate on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for expanding on your sources. Would there be any more questions? I know Betty Govin had commented also, if she would like to expand on that. Okay. While we wait on Betty, I'm seeing Dr. Sharnanan, please go ahead, and then we'll take Vihara Foundation. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My question is maybe to all. When Columbus came, he met some people and he called them Indians. It's very indigenous, but he called them, you know why. After Columbus, the European settlers came and they enslaved these Indians. But the duration of slavery of the Indians was not very long. They took the Chinese to replace these plantation laborers. What is the reason that the Chinese immigration was stopped very soon, not only in the Caribbean, also other countries and Suriname, sure. What was the reason that they stopped the immigration of the intended laborers from China, and they began to transport transoceanic the African migrants enslaved to put them as workers on the plantation? That's my question to anyone.
Dr.
What was the reason that they took the Africans and not the Chinese? Because the duration of Chinese internship is very short.
All right, I know Sharlema and Earl had mentioned this in their presentations. Would you, either of you, like to respond?
Yes, sure. Dr. Chadnan, repeat that question, please, if you don't mind.
After enslaving the Indians, they took the Chinese workers as indentured laborers. But the Chinese, the duration of Chinese indentured laborship is very short. They took the enslaved one. Why was this?
Actually, what really happened is that you had a short period when the Chinese were brought, but upon emancipation and apprenticeship, you had a number of different groups that were tried. So it wasn't necessarily that Africans alone were taken to work. There were free African indentured laborers. There were also Germans who came as indentured laborers. There were British who came as indentured laborers. There were Irish who came as indentured laborers. So during that period when you had Indian indentureship and Chinese indentureship started, you still had a trickle of all of those coming in, but it was not sufficient to satisfy the labor force because you had an exodus of the Africans from the plantation. So while you would have had some plantations employing, becoming mechanized, you still had a number of plantations that were still operating on manual labor. They simply did not have the finances to be able to employ mechanization, and so they had to get manual labor. They would have gotten loans and so on in order to bring in these indentured immigrants. So there was not a period where there was a cutoff between the Germans, for example, and then the Chinese began. No. There was a continuous flow of indentured immigrants, but in smaller numbers. And so the planters had to keep seeking out labor.
Okay, that means that the African workers, that was no money, no pay, that was free. They can enslave them, let them work. But why? There is another reason why they took after, and that is the next question, why they took not the Chinese, but the Indians as indentured labor. Was the quality of the Chinese, were they not satisfied? What was the reason to stop with Chinese?
So,
because let me tell you this too, in Suriname, we know they came before, 10 years before the ending of slavery, but they could not work on the plantation.
May I?
They were not satisfied. The settlers were not satisfied with these people. Is that the reason also in the Caribbean region?
Mr. Shadna, have Mark
Ma-
respond on Anne-Marie. Go ahead.
I think there's a number of issues here. I don't think there's just like one issue that we could say, you know, this is it, and this is the one thing that really stopped the Chinese from coming. I think it was extremely problematic right from the beginning. There were huge problems with even in that journal, the third vessel to leave, okay, for Guyana. There were massive problems with just getting enough Chinese indentured laborers on the boat in the first instance, and getting in, supplying the boat properly to mean, so that there was enough food and water on the boat for it to leave China. All these kind of issues. And then there, as one of the other presenters said, I can't remember who it was, that that there were these different groups on the board. You had the hacker Chinese, and then you have other groups as well who were at loggerheads with each other. So there were these fights breaking out on board the boats, and the British just weren't ready for that. They didn't understand. They saw the Chinese as monolithic, and so they weren't ready for that. And I think there were just too many issues with getting Chinese workers, as well as the Mandarins, I think, wanting to actually stop their people right from leaving their country and stopping the system itself. So I think if we start to look at it, we could come up with a really long list of reasons why that system kind of collapsed. But I'm seeing Dr. Leloy's hand raised, so let me hand over to her, perhaps.
Yes.
Well, this is actually something that Dr. Mohammed had mentioned in her talk. This is a capitalist endeavor, and it was more expensive to bring in the Chinese. I think some of the numbers that I've seen, it was sometimes more than twice as much to bring in a Chinese indentured laborer as a laborer from India. So if you are a planter whose plantation is already in debt, because many of them were already in debt, you're going to go for the cheaper labor source. So that was one of the major drivers of why the Chinese, and of course, it's been kind of hinted at. Again, I think Dr. Mohammed might have said it most explicitly, but you have to remember that in 1866, there was the passing of the Kung Convention, which required West Indian planters to pay the return passage for the Chinese, right? And that they didn't want to do as well. The Chinese were also, as we've said, I think everyone has sort of mentioned, in the 19th century, traveling all around the world. So they had a lot of locations to go to. The pull to go to North America, in particular to the Gold Mountain, was extremely strong. So there wasn't, it wasn't like they were desperately desiring to come to the West Indies to work. There were other places that the Chinese could go to work. And there was really, I don't think that we really quite grasped the competition for Chinese labor at that time. It was a real impetus to get Chinese labor, which is one of the reasons why you find them all around the globe. So there was a number of factors, I think, that went into play that reduced the amount of time that the Chinese spent as indentured laborers in the West Indies.
Great, thank you all for the response. Shani, would you like to go next? I hope you're able to unmute.
Hi, actually, some of the questions were answered. I was just wanting to say it was really interesting to see the comparison between the Indian and Chinese indentured laborers. We have both here in Jamaica, so that was a good comparison. Even though it's from Trinidad, I could begin to understand perhaps the situation would have been similar here. I did want to ask, so most of the Chinese that came to Jamaica were Hakka, but was there anything in particular that you could say made them want to come at that period, apart from what was happening in China? Why specifically the Hakka?
Well, why specifically the Hakka? The Hakka were a marginalized people in southern China. They were actually known as the guest people. They had migrated south, and the Cantonese, were competing with them for resources at this time that's very turbulent, as we've been mentioning, in the 19th century. So they weren't exactly welcomed in the south of China at that time. They were also the leader of the Taiping Rebellion that we've mentioned. He was also Hakka. He was somebody who had he thought he was the brother of Jesus, so he had some connection to Christianity, and so this was another reason why the Hakka were perhaps not so popular in southern China at that time. So they were also open to, especially in British Guyana. I think Dr. Tunbridge will probably tell you that there was a Reverend Lobsheed who's connected with the migration of the Chinese into British Guyana. So those Chinese that were converted, for example, were also being encouraged to migrate. Can't say that they were Chinese Christians, the Hakka Christians who came in Jamaica, but certainly they might have been exposed. So I think that the Hakka people in general, Hakka people as a cultural value are not afraid to migrate if it's going to be better opportunities for their children. And that's part of their long history. So you have a group of people who are not particularly welcome in southern China at that time around Canton, who have this history where it's okay to migrate if you're going to make it better for the next generation. And so they are, I would say, particularly prone or open to migrating by the time 1884 comes.
Okay, thank you very much. Vihara Foundation, I know you had a question. Your hand was up. Are you able to unmute? Please unmute. Vihara Foundation. Betty, are you able to unmute also? All right, there seemed to be some difficulty with that. Arnold, would you like to?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dennis Ramdahan. Great presentations. I'm sorry I came in late, but I just wanted to add a few things to the conversation if it wasn't already discussed. The opium trade. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, the opium trade by the British, where the British was basically controlling the lands and the labor in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, growing the opium and then trading it with Hong Kong, which triggered the opium wars with China and resulted in the ceding of Hong Kong. That's an important aspect in history that bonds India and China. I also wanted to say, are there any data on the total population of Chinese immigrants that came to the Caribbean? And do these records exist in the National Archives as do the Indian records? And are Chinese searching these ancestral records and trying to locate their ancestral villages? These are the things I just wanted to ask.
May I respond on just briefly on the opium, if I may? Yeah, if I might respond on the opium. That's actually a really important factor, because that opium trade that is running between India, where the opium is being grown, it's then being taken into China by the merchant navy. At least in part, the British merchant navy are then taking the opium into China, and the revenue from that is absolutely huge. Okay, that the money that is coming in from that opium is supporting not only that whole kind of system through from India into China, but more or less supporting the kind of whole of empire. And the figures are there for exactly how much money and revenue that was coming, and that's openly admitted by the administration at the time, that the amount of money that is coming is kind of supporting everything else that's going on. We've already heard talk about the sugar industry being in crisis, and other really big kind of issues in terms of financially with what is going on, not only in in the Caribbean, but elsewhere in the empire. And that amount of money that is coming from that opium is really, it's kind of supporting the empire in a really big way. So it's a really important point that's being made. Maybe someone else could pick up on the other part of that gentleman's question.
Yeah, sure. Shakira, let me just add something to Mr. Ramdahin's question about the total number of Chinese migrants that would have come to the Caribbean. Mr. Ramdahin, Walton Luplei's book, Indentured Labor, Caribbean Sugar, has an excellent list of appendices. And in there, he would have stated that over the period 1806 to 1884, you would have had a total number of 18,787 Chinese coming to the Caribbean. Those would have embarked on the ship. Who actually landed would have numbered 18,002. Of those who embarked on the ships, 808 would have died, unfortunately, and 23 were born at sea. And he also gives a breakdown of the numbers that came to the different countries. So British Guyana had, by large, the most, 13,539 landed in British Guyana. In Trinidad, 2,837. Jamaica, 1,152. And British Honduras, 474 in total. So I hope that adds value.
Thank you very much.
Could I also just add that, and I'm also reading Sharnice Bullock's comment in the chat as well, that, when the Chinese come as indentured laborers, they're not coming like the Africans and being totally cut off from their lineage and their villages. Most of the Chinese know which village they came from. Many of them intended to go back to those villages as, this is just a laboring sojourn as well. And then when you get into the 20th century, most of the ones who come are sending money back. So people did know. I know my family, for example, my uncle would tell us that each village has you call it a temple, but it has a list of families. So it's so strange to know that my father's name, who was born in Jamaica, is actually listed somewhere there. So it's not that people were totally disconnected from their villages, is that they couldn't find their villages. They can find their villages, depending on their family situations. And just to point out, indenture, if you're thinking about indenture in particular, that is a British colonial enterprise activity. And if anything about the British, they were good record keepers. So there's a lot of records on indenture. If you go to the UK, you go to the National Library, you go to the archives, there's a lot of documentation that you could find. It's just taking the time to sit there and make your way through it. And then two last comments, the Southern Baptist comments, I think, just to throw that out there for people who are interested in Chinese Christians. I think that Guyana was the first Christian Chinese church in the West. I think it was Anglican, but I think that's the first organized Christian church in the West. And just because Dr. Tumbridge did this, I just want to say a shout out to David Davidian as well, who was my supervisor. He was also very important because I was planning to do totally different research when I met him. And then he kind of said, go in this direction. And he was right. So thank you to David Davidian.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. Would there be any comments or final questions?
I see Dr. Thomas is raising his hand.
Yes, Arnold, yes, go ahead, please. Can you unmute? Yes.
Okay, I think I've got it now. Yeah, no, I just want to first of all say very, very interesting presentations. I particularly enjoyed Shalima's piece. My very brief comment is that before the Indians started coming here, the planters in St. Vincent also put forward a proposal to recruit indentured Chinese labor. However, the proposal was turned down. Oops, that was my dog. The proposal was turned down by the colonial office because it would have been too expensive to bring Chinese into St. Vincent. So we never had any Chinese indentured labor. Thank you.
I see our time is almost up, so we will just be very quick with Vihara Foundation. And then the last person, Mr. Lee. Please go ahead. Are you, please? Okay.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, first off, I'd like to say thank you very much to all three of you for the great presentations, because I've just started my first year PhD studies in the Chinese identity in the Caribbean, and which has really enriched my understanding. I have a question about opium smoking and gambling, because I've read that because of these two issues, many plantation owners didn't find Chinese workers to be as industrious and docile as they had anticipated. And they also feared that these vices would spread to other groups. So I was wondering, like, can you provide some historical context on the prevalence of opium smoking and gambling among Chinese indentured workers in the Caribbean? And how were these activities perceived by the broader society and the plantation owners? And have these two of them, like gambling, opium smoking, affect the reputation and treatment of Chinese workers compared to other indentured or enslaved groups? Thank you.
That's quite a lot. Mark, would you like to respond?
Yeah, if I may, and yeah, you're kind of absolutely on point there in terms of your questions. Well, in the case of Guyana, you know, here during the 19th century, and it's kind of just like mind blowing and unbelievable now. But along the coast there, you know, in Georgetown, and then regularly kind of in certain places along the coast, there were retail outlets for opium, you know, opium dens that people could go to you know, to get opium. And it was definitely, you know, coming over on the boats with the migrants. But I think it was actually being, you know, brought in here as almost like a kind of capital. So in other words, it was there to, you know, kind of pacify the indentured laborers to some extent, and, you know, do things like ease their, you know, it would ease their pain, and you know, as they were, if they had any pains during working, if you give someone opium, then it's going to stop that pain, right? So it would then become, you know, almost, you know, part of capital that would then be helping you to you know, to make the sugar, right? Which is where you're then how it's then perceived. It's kind of extremely, you know, frowned upon, and you know, other colonial agents have criticized Chinese workers for you know, taking and indulging in opium, when it's actually the British, right, that are you know, getting this product, this thing produced, shipping it around the world globally, and then have the temerity to say, you know, you shouldn't be smoking this thing, is something else, right? So but there's a lot of work, right, that still needs to be done on opium. It's an area that I've done quite a bit of reading and work on, so I'm interested, and I'm glad to see that others are coming along with an interest in that area. And yeah, so I hope that's begun to answer your questions, and by all means, if you need any more info, then just get in touch with me. That's fine. I've got no problem with that.
Okay, Mark, you want to put in your information on the chat, and Ms. Lee, you can connect.
Sure, I will. Yeah, I will. Thanks.
That would be great. So Vihara Foundation, I know you were trying earlier. Do you want to unmute? This will be our last question, and it will be very quick because we need to close off the program. All right, it seemed he has gone, so we will end the program, and I want to thank all our speakers. It was an absolutely fantastic presentation from each one. We want to thank you all for your sacrifice and for giving freely of your time, your knowledge, and your expertise. And we want to thank also all the members of our audience on Zoom and on YouTube for attending and participating. As was said earlier, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and you can feel free to contact the ICC to publish your books and your reports. Remember that we are asking you to kindly give us your suggestions as well as a donation, and you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahabir for details. Thank you also to the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir, and to our IT manager behind the scenes, Ravin Ramsingh, who has been recording the program and will upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity, and to Miriam Mohammed for producing our TikTok videos. Our topic next Sunday will be part 2, maintaining Indian identity as an ethnic minority in the Indian diaspora. So please visit our YouTube channel to see all our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.
Bye. Bye. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks. It was a good presentation, good participation. So see you next time. Every Sunday, we have different topics. So thank you all, Mark, Anne-Marie, Earl, Shalima. It was great.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.